Well, hello and welcome to this climate change book review hosted by Northeast Metro Climate Action. We are a volunteer-led community organization. Our mission is to raise awareness about the climate crisis and potential solutions here in the Northeast Metro and throughout the Twin Cities. We do outreach events. This is our third virtual Zoom event since the beginning of the pandemic, and we have more scheduled. We'll talk about that at the end. Today our members will give a 2 to 3 minute overview of the books that you see here, and with a recommendation on these books and some insight on why we should read these books. One of the most important things we can do as individuals is to educate ourselves about what is happening, why it's happening, and what we can do about climate change. And we will start with Steve Ollinger. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, I wanted to recommend the book Crossing Antarctica by Will Steger. I've been a fan of Steger since his dog sled journey to the North Pole without resupply in 1986. Then I heard him do a lecture on climate change and his expedition to Antarctica and found out that he had written a book about that adventure. I needed to read it. It is the adventure aspect of this book that makes this climate book different from many other climate books. It's not a how-to book telling us what must be done to help resolve the climate crisis. Instead, this book energizes you to do something because it gives a glimpse of what we are losing. You probably heard of the disintegration of the Larsen B ice shelf in Antarctica in 2002. The adventure that Steger writes about crossed this ice shelf 13 years earlier. He writes, "There is no way to comprehend the massiveness of this disintegration unless you have skied and walked across it." Hopefully, this book will give you a little bit of that feeling. Crossing Antarctica gives you a glimpse of what is being lost to a warming climate, and does it in a very captivating way. It started in 1989 in July, ended in March of 1990. The 222 days are covered in detail using diary entries that were documented during the expedition when the days were like minus 50, minus 60 degrees below, 100-mile-an-hour winds, crossing crevasses, accidents with out-of-control sleds that need to be fixed during a blizzard, not being able to locate vital supply caches, and one member getting lost in a blizzard simply checking the dogs outside the tent and having to spend the night in minus 40-degree weather without heavy weather gear. Getting lost because of too much blowing snow. It also has days that are far warmer than they should be. This book has it all. Plus, it ends with an epilogue explaining that Will and his partners are continuing their work of educating people on climate and the need to preserve the continent of Antarctica from problems such as mining that need major international cooperation. That includes climate change. Thanks. Pick up Crossing Antarctica. I think you'll like it. And now, Lori.
Hi, I'd like to tell you about the book Overdressed, The Shockingly High Cost of Cheap Fashion. Have you ever been shopping and heard someone say, "I don't really need this, but it's so cheap, why not?" Even if you think you know a lot about the fast fashion industry, you might be surprised to learn about the real impacts of buying so much stuff that we don't really need. In her book Overdressed, Elizabeth Klein takes us behind the scenes, explains how it all got started and what drives us to want to buy poorly made clothes made from cheap fabrics, even when our closets are already full. Many people think, "I always donate it when I'm done, so what's the real impact?" There is an impact. Every garment has a carbon footprint from the manufacturer to shipping to disposal. Klein has an interesting section on the reuse market. Vintage clothes are what is sought after. The huge volume of cheap synthetic fabrics is overwhelming the reuse system. and much of it ends up in the trash. Klein also shines light on the tremendous damage to the environment and the health of the workers in countries like China, India, and Cambodia, where much of the manufacturing occurs. It's a double-edged sword for the workers. They have jobs, but those jobs come at a high cost. There's a constant drive to keep costs low so that we have a steady supply of cheap clothes. The one messages that I got from the book is we should buy less, we should buy better quality, and we should look for sustainable. I recommend Overdressed by Elizabeth Klein. I hope you'll check it out. Next, Judy.
Thank you. I read the book, The Man Who Planted Trees. It's a story of lost groves, the science of trees, and a plan to save the planet, authored by Jim Robbins. I was surprised to learn how little we really know about trees. There's limited research, partly because trees grow and die so slowly that the research has to be committed for the long haul. Now, parts of the book focus on David Mullark, a man on a mission. David had a near-death experience, and upon awakening, felt his mission was to clone the championship trees, plant their offspring in living archivals to preserve their DNA. He believed these old living creatures, such as the mighty redwoods, the old oak, and the battered bristlewoods, had experienced so much life over their living for several hundred centuries, that maybe they held the key in knowledge to helping keep our natural world in balance. Now, it's hard to imagine a world without trees, but that is where we're headed. Logging and mass die-offs from disease have taken the majority of our old growth forests, leaving us now with junk and decorative trees. So why is that a problem? Well, the book gives a lot of great examples that are important in our current climate change culture. Water that transpires from forests has a robust cooling effect on the earth. Trees can store thousands of pounds of carbon over their lifetime. Tree roots can help remediate contaminated soil, and trees can be used as filter systems for air and water. The book also talks about health benefits of trees, which I found most interesting, from the microbes being discovered on the trees to use as antibiotics. Chemicals that the trees broadcast are shown to relieve asthma and used in cancer preventative treatment. I learned that aspirin originally came from the bark of willow tree. Trees act as natural mood elevators to reduce anxiety and depression. One interesting study I found in the book was that we've seen a decline in human health tied to the disappearance of trees, and that's kind of scary. Some experts say reforestation cannot affect the kind of transformation that some of us are looking for, and that planting trees is just a feel-good thing. But after reading the book, I got a sense of what trees might be capable of, and I was captivated to learn a lot more. So I really encourage you to look at this book and take a glance. And now I'll turn it over to Lincoln.
I'd like to tell you about The Climate of Hope by Michael Bloomberg and Carl Pope, both strong environmental and climate activists. Pope is a former executive director and chairman of the Sierra Club, and Bloomberg is former mayor of New York City and a businessman. Speaking in an engaging style, the authors present hopeful and beneficial ways to stop fossil fuel pollution and build resilience into infrastructure and ecosystems to minimize the impacts that we will continue to experience for some time to come. The authors emphasize the great opportunities for improving our environment, our economy, our job markets, and all living things on this planet. Besides succinctly explaining the causes of climate change and the impacts we are already suffering, the authors cover existing renewable energy technologies and methods to replace fossil fuel-based industries and energy production. They also tell about success stories where renewable energy systems have been implemented. This is the hope that the book focuses on, that there are ways now to convert to renewable energy-based economy and be better off for it. The book argues that given the lack of climate change response in the US and elsewhere in the world, it is local units of government that must take action. They detail several examples of groups already formed and cooperatively working toward meeting the goals set forth in the Paris Climate Accord. The book is well written, easily readable, full of information giving hope to this crisis we're in. And if you could use a dose of something hopeful and are interested in positive ways that have already been proven effective toward reducing global warming, I recommend it. Thank you. And now to Chuck.
The cover of the book, subtitled How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. It was written by climate scientist Michael Mann with cartoons about climate change by Washington Post editorial cartoonist Tom Tolles. Michael Mann said, "I think what's unique about the book is using satire and comedy and irony and exposing of hypocrisy about this issue in a way that's both entertaining and informative." The biggest reason I'm recommending this book is that on a subject as heavy as the climate crisis is and or can be, it makes it quite a bit easier reading to have cartoons by Tom Tolles sprinkled through the book. And they're not just randomly sprinkled, they are integrated into the structure and content of the book. In a first chapter titled Science, How It Works, Michael Mann makes the point that science is a pursuit of truth, that it does not operate like bargaining, where the conclusion, the goal, is to reach a middle point that's partly satisfactory to each party. Rather, there is one scientific truth, and as a non-scientist looks at perhaps competing claims about what's true, Michael Mann makes the point that what's needed is for people to look for the preponderance of evidence that's being produced by true climate scientists. So let's not fall into the abyss of thinking that reality is somewhere in the middle between contesting viewpoints. This one makes the point that in this climate crisis, we and our kids and grandkids are in the test tube as this planetary scale experiment happens in warming Earth's atmosphere, and not yet being entirely sure what all the consequences of that are going to be. But there is almost universal consensus that the consequences are not good. Here's an example. 0 on this thermometer is global average temperatures before we started burning oil and gas and coal. And each degree additional is how much we have or will have warmed the planet above pre-industrial global average temperatures. And the 4 degrees Celsius is what we're on course for by the end of this century, if we don't get radical change in our practices, principally the burning of fossil fuels. Notice that that would have impacts like coastal cities like New York City submerged, and 50% of all species known currently becoming extinct within the next 80 to 100 years. Denial gets a lot of examination in the book. Here's one cartoon about how persistent and stubborn denial can be. Here's another with mounting evidence that we're in for trouble with climate change. It seems the response from some continues to be just putting their heads in the sand and denying that there's a problem. In another conference just around the time the book was published in October of 2016, Michael Mann said, "I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the fate of the planet to some extent will rest on this next presidential election in the US. And I certainly hope that my fellow Americans make the right choice, a choice to preserve the planet for our children and grandchildren." Now that was said 4 years ago, but it's even more true now about this election. So I hope that you'll find a copy of The Madhouse Effect, read it, and perhaps recommend it to your friends as well. Thank you. And next we have Steve.
All right, thanks, Chuck. I will be doing the book, The Future We Choose by Cristina Figueres. She is the primary architect of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. And the book is a combination of the story behind the getting agreement on the Paris Climate Accord, also intertwined with more of a how-to book of what our economies, our society, our consumer and consumption habits should look like in order to fend off the worst effects of climate change. Christina starts with a bleak description of what our world might look like in the end of this century if we don't do anything, if we continue to support fossil fuel infrastructure. But she follows up with a much more uplifting view of what our world could look like if we do make the right choices. The core of her book are the 10 actions that she lays out and defines. I'll just touch on a couple of those. Defending the truth is a big one, just as Chuck had mentioned with the climate deniers. In this case, supporting real science, making sure we use evidence-based decision-making is a big part of turning us in the right direction. Seeing yourself as a citizen and not a consumer. We need to stop buying so much stuff, as Lori mentioned in her book, that we buy a lot of things that we don't really need and throw them away. Of course, we need to move beyond fossil fuels. Primarily, first thing, cut the subsidies to fossil fuels. We spend way more tax dollars on subsidizing fossil fuels than we do for renewable energy. And that needs to stop. Reforesting the earth. It picks up on Judy's book of The Man Who Planted Trees with deforestation is a big cause of carbon emissions, and it's very closely tied to our consumption of red meat. Much deforestation is a result of clearing land for cattle and clearing land for crops to feed those cattle. And then rewilding open spaces as well. We need to invest in a clean economy, a circular economy, as opposed to our current linear economy where we dig things up out of the ground, use them once, throw them away, which we need to stop doing. And a very interesting chapter on building gender equity. Christina claims, and I agree 100%, when women lead, good things happen, which is great advice. There is a few more as well. She leaves us with two very important thoughts. Number one, we still have a choice about our future. Every action we take counts. And second, we are capable of making the right choices about our own destiny. We are not doomed to a devastating future. Humanity is not flawed and incapable of solving big problems. If we act, we need to act quickly and together. So again, I recommend The Future We Choose by Christina Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac. Those are the 6 books for review tonight, hoping that you are inspired to pick up one or more of these and learn more about different parts of the climate crisis and solutions, and educating ourselves about this as we move forward. And thanks for attending. Our next live stream event will be on August 24th. It will feature 2 local authors of climate-related books for children and teens. Carolyn Wilhelm, the author of the book Climate Change Captives 2035, which is a fictional account, and then Dawn Pape with her soon-to-be-released novel for teens called Ejected. And we will have a much more in-depth discussion with Carolyn and Dawn about their books. So tune in for that. We will have information on our website, northeastmetroclimateaction.org. It's a long URL, but it's logical. And also friend us on Facebook, and you can see updates with our Northeast Metro Climate Action Facebook page. So thank you again for joining us this evening with this climate change book review. Again, we'll hope you're inspired to find some of these books and read them yourselves.